Next on Link TV, Latin Pulse, news and analysis from Latin America as seen by Latin American media, followed by a panel discussion on the issues. Next on Latin Pulse, only on Link TV.
The following program is an original production of Link TV.
La mayoría de ellos son entre 18 a 27 años.
From soccer stadiums to Main Street, violence seems to be an everyday reality in most of Latin America. Bloodshed and aggression are an everyday occurrence. What impact does American politics and culture have on all this? This and more coming up next on Latin Pulse. Hello and welcome to Pulso Latino. I'm your host, Ana Cuevas. Our first topic tonight, violence and crime in Latin America and the influence of the United States. As we struggle with violence on our own streets, dealing with rough neighborhoods or dangerous drug addicts, Latin America has its own stories to tell. Historically, the region has been plagued by thieves, pickpockets, and bandits trying to make a living the easy way. Some say the causes are social inequality combined with a lack of educational opportunities in many of these countries. As RN Televisión reports, in Cali, Colombia, the criminals are now so bold, people can't safely walk the streets in broad daylight.
Es un seguimiento que hizo la policía y la fiscalía desde hace varios meses a una banda de atracadores que tenía azotado el sector del Calvario en el centro de Cali. El video es la evidencia. Las víctimas, como este hombre que es llevado hasta un poste de energía, son despojadas de todas sus pertenencias en una acción donde participan hasta niños. En el sitio, ni los trabajadores del sistema de transporte masivo se escapan de los delincuentes. Las mujeres son presa fácil. Además de robarles, las amenazan con filosos cuchillos. Adultos mayores como este hombre que se desplaza en una moto son abordados y en cuestión de segundos, como un enjambre, caen todos los integrantes de la banda y lo asaltan.
Vamos a tener muy pronto la decisión ya definitiva en la audiencia pública que va a determinar es la condena de estas personas.
Ahora esta banda deberá someterse a la nueva ley que por asaltos como este pueden recibir penas hasta de 8 años.
Central America has a serious problem with youth gangs. Some have literally taken over entire neighborhoods and cities in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Some argue this problem is a byproduct of U.S. foreign policy as well as immigration laws. In the 1980s, young people fled Central America and went to the U.S. to escape civil war. Once here, many joined gangs, only to be deported back to their countries in the 1990s. As a result, they took their gang activities with them. Latinoamérica TV reports this year alone, thousands have died in Guatemala, victims of gang violence.
Autoridades de la Policía Nacional Civil dijeron que el primer hecho ocurrió en un barrio popular de Villanueva, ubicado en la periferia sur de la capital. Durante el enfrentamiento murieron un agente de la policía, 2 supuestos pandilleros de la Mara 18 que participaron en el tiroteo y 2 vecinos que pasaban al momento de este enfrentamiento. Otro agente falleció al ingresar a la sala de urgencias de un hospital público. Según la Policía Nacional, un supuesto pandillero de 14 años fue detenido luego de que, en medio de la confusión, intentara robar el arma y equipo de radio del agente fallecido. Cabe la pena resaltar que los altos índices de violencia que afectan a Guatemala se han cobrado la vida de más de 2.700 personas en lo que va de este año.
Mexico has its share of violent crime, but most of it is due to the open turf war between drug cartels fighting for control of the U.S. drug market. Some cartels have recruited thousands of former police and military officers to serve as their armed enforcers. They call themselves Los Zetas. Mexico's Canal 11 reports on a gruesome finding that now involves the Secretary of Public Safety for the state of Veracruz.
Y en el puerto de Veracruz fueron descubiertos el cuerpo y la cabeza de un hombre en 2 bolsas de plástico. También había un mensaje en el que se amenaza al secretario de Seguridad Pública del Estado de Veracruz, Juan Manuel Orozco Méndez, y se le acusa de proteger a los Zetas. En el mismo mensaje se indica que la persona decapitada era integrante de los Zetas y advierte que seguirán las ejecuciones contra miembros de este grupo, incluido Juan Manuel Orozco Méndez.
Violence is nothing new inside prisons, and Latin America is no exception. Centroamérica TV has the following report about prisoners taking the law into their own hands. They were dealing with 3 inmates serving time for raping and killing 2 children. Be forewarned, the graphic nature of the following video may be disturbing.
Puede servir de mensaje para aquellos que alguna vez han planeado violar y asesinar a un menor de edad. Es de esta forma como iniciaron los hechos en la Penitenciaría Nacional. Los 3 individuos que supuestamente participaron en la violación y asesinato de los 2 menores en Guaymaca fueron asesinados simultáneamente en módulos diferentes. Según algunas autoridades, esto se interpreta como un código de presidiarios. Al parecer, con esta acción hicieron sentir a los presuntos asesinos lo que sufrieron los niños. Pero horas más tarde, los presidiarios se ensañaron con los cuerpos sin vida y procedieron a prenderles fuego. Todo esto ocurría mientras los internos rodeaban la escena como si se trataba de un carnaval. Las autoridades de medicina forense trataban de encontrar entre las cenizas parte de los cuerpos. Mientras al otro extremo, en el hogar conocido como Casa Blanca, se vivía algo similar. Al joven que ahí murió le tocó la misma suerte. A este le cercenaron una de sus manos que apareció a unos metros del cuerpo. Las autoridades prácticamente quedaban sin palabras ante lo sucedido.
We all know soccer is a game of passion. Latin America is recognized for having some of the best teams in the world, as well as some of the top soccer players. But when a match doesn't turn out as expected, things can get out of hand, and soccer fans can turn violent, as we see in the following report from Colombia's RCN.
En total, 24 personas resultaron heridas, hubo lesionados con arma blanca y personas golpeadas con palos y piedras.
Son por heridas por arma blanca, ¿no? Y compromete más que todo tórax.
Una de las personas que llegó al hospital universitario de Neiva presentaba heridas con arma de fuego.
Una persona de 38 años por arma de fuego, ¿no? Y la mayoría de ellos son entre 18 a 27 años.
En las tribunas del estadio hubo desmanes y vandalismo que después del partido se trasladaron a algunas calles de la ciudad y dejaron pérdidas materiales cuantiosas. La policía reportó que 2 personas están detenidas y 4 heridos permanecen hospitalizados.
But when does violent behavior begin? Some say children are taught to act out by movies, video games, even their family and friends. As Mexico's Canal 11 reports, some kids are quite comfortable with violence at an early age.
La edad de mayor riesgo para el inicio de un comportamiento violento es entre los 14 y 15 años de edad. Son los tiempos de la secundaria. Para muchos el estudio parece aburrido. Nada llama la atención. En plena adolescencia es común atestiguar o protagonizar escenas como esta. El patio de la escuela, el lote baldío o la calle afuera del plantel se convierten en una arena de box. ¿Los motivos para el pleito a esta edad? Cualquiera, pero no todo queda en una simple pelea. La violencia entre los jóvenes se manifiesta en la conformación de pandillas o bandas que se enfrentan en nombre de su escuela con otros jóvenes de su edad. Cualquier forma de violencia representa un aspecto desafiante para padres de familia. 45% de los jóvenes que inician con ofensas violentas antes de la edad de 11 años continúan por este camino cuando ya han pasado los 20. El grupo más afectado es la población de entre 15 y 25 años. Sin embargo, viene incrementándose de manera alarmante otro grupo, el de aquellos entre los 12 y los 15 años. Así, el adolescente es el principal actor de la violencia y también es víctima de ella.
Whatever the reason behind the violence, it's certainly not accepted in most parts of the world. In Guatemala, for example, one town is so fed up with crime, they're promising to fight violence with violence, as we see in the following report from Guatevisión.
Él es Víctor Alfonso Pérez, detenido bajo sospechas de haber despojado de sus pertenencias a Juan Fernando Rivera en la colonia 1 de Julio.
¿Y qué? Después lo sacan y después lo mismo. No es justo. Aquí la primera de julio ya está organizada para que ya no entren más los ladrones. Ladrón que entre aquí lo vamos a matar y se los vamos a entregar a los policías porque ahorita me di cuenta que los policías en vez de cubrirlo a uno, cubren a los ladrones.
Yo sí quiero ser muy claro, espero que esta gente que agarren el tipo que detuvieron no lo vayan a soltar, que en la primera de cambio por falta de mérito lo suelten. Yo me constituyo en testigo y si es necesario ir a debate, yo quiero ir y señalarlo, porque por eso es que estos desgraciados hacen lo que quieren con nosotros.
For almost 40 years, Colombia has been torn apart by the battling of 3 groups: guerrilla rebels, drug traffickers, and paramilitary groups. All use violence to promote their individual agendas. This undeclared war has forced thousands to flee their neighborhoods, their towns, and in some cases, even their countries. Now, some refugees are finding help in Mexico, as we see in this report from Canal 11.
Años de una guerra interna que ha desplazado o motivado a huir de sus tierras a 2.5 millones de personas. Se trata de Colombia, que después de Afganistán es el país del mundo con mayor número de refugiados. Ser militar o político de oposición puede ser suficiente para tener los días contados.
En el momento en el que el conflicto armado trasciende ya hacia la sociedad civil, entonces golpea sobre todo a los partidos de oposición por la existencia del paramilitarismo, por la, la confusión que hay entre el actor político y el terrorista.
En el marco del Día Mundial del Refugiado, México abre sus puertas a estas personas que huyen para proteger su vida, seguridad y libertad. Ya con documento en mano, los refugiados buscan reiniciar sus vidas y eventualmente el reencuentro familiar.
No, pues aquí en México más tranquilo, ya con el documento FM3 ya pienso la unificación familiar, mi familia que todavía está corriendo peligro en Colombia.
In Colombia, leftist rebels funded by drug lords are on one side of the conflict. Right-wing paramilitary groups sponsored by wealthy families are on the other side. The government now hopes to fight the violence by disrupting the money supporting the war. For example, it's looking to prosecute 8 U.S. employees of banana giant Chiquita brands. They're accused of financing arms purchases for a violent paramilitary group. But those in Colombia who simply want to live in peace are caught in the crossfire of the ongoing war. Just recently, in the capital city of Bogotá, thousands took to the streets to protest kidnappings and killings and to pray for an end to all the madness.
El corazón de Bogotá palpitó como nunca en esta histórica jornada de repudio al secuestro. La Plaza de Bolívar, el mismo lugar en donde durante los últimos años los familiares de los secuestrados han clamado casi solitarios por la liberación de sus allegados, parecía pequeña frente a los miles de ciudadanos que indignados salieron a marchar tras el asesinato de los 11 diputados del Valle. Con pancartas, flores, bombas, pañuelos, pitos, camisetas estampadas con cientos de mensajes, los bogotanos expresaron su solidaridad con los secuestrados.
Sé que todo Colombia quiere la libertad de los secuestrados, yo lo sé.
El presidente Álvaro Uribe, su familia y todos los integrantes de su gobierno también marcharon.
Solidaridad con los familiares y firmeza frente a los terroristas.
Las autoridades locales, encabezadas por el alcalde mayor Luis Eduardo Garzón, agradecieron este inmenso gesto a la ciudadanía.
To discuss the issue of violence in Latin America, we have in our studio today Ted Lewis, Director of the Human Rights Program at Global Exchange, and Benjamin Lessing from the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome. A recent study indicated that violence is one of the 5 top main causes of death in Latin America. What role does U.S. culture play in this, if any?
I think that U.S. culture is a very important part of what goes on in Latin America. There is, of course, the kind of culture of violence and acquisition that comes out of Hollywood, something that is seen throughout Latin America as well as in the United States. And while that has a pernicious effect in the United States, I think outside the country it's even worse because there's not the example of the reality of life to balance that off. So people really think that those are things that not only should be, but can be aspired to, that they see through that medium. But I think even more importantly, in terms of looking at the overall context of violence in Latin America, we really have to look at the deeper elements of U.S. policy in the region. For decades, the United States backed and in many ways continues to back regimes that practice violence. Currently, that would be the case in Colombia, and it's been far worse. Throughout the 1980s, of course, we knew about the death squad violence that was being practiced throughout Central America, and Ronald Reagan, though he is lionized now as a great president, was very much aware of and backing the groups, both government and private, that were behind that violence. And that has left a legacy throughout the region that we're harvesting the bitter fruits of now.
Mr. Lessing, how does this affect immigration and immigration policy into the U.S.?
I think there's a sort of a basic logic that says when there's extreme violence going on in a Latin American country, you're going to get a lot of refugees, a lot of political exiles, and just a lot of immigration for economic reasons as well. But then it also goes on at a lower level throughout the region when you just have high levels of street crime or high levels of institutional problems with police or public security in general. That leads to economic problems, so there's definitely a relation. I wanted to add on something to Ted's comments. I think that it goes, you can even go back a little bit further and look at the period in the 60s and 70s when U.S. policy supported authoritarian regimes throughout the region. With the Carter presidency, that support pretty much ended, and a lot of those authoritarian regimes reverted to democracies. However, a lot of the police forces in those countries were formed under the authoritarian regime. So you still have a very repressive police force that was never really trained to respect the rights of citizens. It was rather trained to repress and crack down on citizens and dissent. And still the effects of that are being felt today.
Well, there's a lot of corruption, but the reality is a lot of these forces were trained by the United States.
Yeah, you have a lot of the top leadership within the police corps or within the militaries of these countries had training at the School of the Americas back in the day.
Is there any way for the United States to help counter that, Mr. Lewis?
Well, there have been attempts, for example, back in the 1990s, Senator Leahy put an amendment in through Congress that called on the United States to identify people in military units in Latin America that were human rights violators. However, there has never been good follow-up on that by the U.S. authorities in the region. We worked very hard with the United States Embassy in Mexico to try to get them to follow through on what was required by the Leahy Amendment, and were tremendously frustrated by their unwillingness, really, to follow through. The kind of political will that's necessary to crack down on human rights violators simply hasn't been there, and that continues to be the case. And I think in terms of the immigration question that you raised, our policies in Latin America have not been focused on the kind of economic development that's necessary to slow immigration. In fact, while our direct support for authoritarian and military governments has dropped in the recent decade, we've moved to trade policies that are putting tremendous pressures on communities in Mexico and in Central America. If Mexico and Central America, the undocumented migrants to the United States that have their origins from Central America and Mexico is over 80% of people, and that flow has doubled since the NAFTA Accord was implemented. So that's something that is strikingly absent from the discussion of immigration in the United States today. And I think it's another way of looking at violence, because the kind of violence that comes from bad economic policy, while it's perhaps not as bad as having a death squad knock on your door at midnight and take your family, it does have the effect of breaking communities and forcing people into situations that they'd prefer not to be in.
But Mr. Lessing, how can those governments go ahead and reduce violence if the people in charge of enforcing the law are corrupt themselves?
Well, you know, corruption is endemic, and it's particularly bad, within police forces, and not so much the case in armed forces, although there as well. And what happens is, you know, when you've got a lucrative drug trade or other illicit activities going on, a trade in arms frequently, you're naturally going to get corruption in those branches that have access to arms or that have access to borders, control of borders, and so you end up with a situation where you're sort of pushing on a string. You know, you'd like to enforce a policy, you'd like to change the way that the police operate or that the army operates, but you just simply can't. The central state has lost control over its own coercive apparatus. And my own research, I study the prisons systems in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. These systems have been taken over by criminal gangs. The Comando Vermelho is an infamous gang that controls a lot of the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. It started as a prison gang, and a lot of its strength grows from the fact that it controls the prison system.
Because we actually one of the stories that we just saw has to do with the prisoners taking law into their own hands, so pretty much they just do whatever they want inside the prison. Absolutely. What happens is the state isn't really able to protect the rights of prisoners. That's really last on their list. I mean, we've already got human rights violations of normal citizens, so the last thing these governments are concerned with is protecting the rights of prisoners. So prisoners form groups. They form organizations that protect themselves, and those groups end up becoming criminal syndicates with a lot of power. Once the state's lost control of its own prisons,
it's a very slippery slope. You know, the state of Sao Paulo took a kind of mano dura approach and put a lot of people in jail over the last 12 years. The prison population has tripled. That's led to the rise of the Primeiro Comando de Capital, the PCC, a very powerful group that in May of 2006 basically took the city hostage with a series of attacks. So you see how they've sort of sowed the seeds of their own chaos in this situation.
But Mr. Lewis, it's more really than just a criminal activity. I mean, we also see violence in sporting events, soccer games. Is it something that is endemic to the region?
I don't think that violence is endemic to the region. I think that we're seeing in various, urban settings around the world at this point, these kind of problems. Witness France in the recent year where there were tremendous riots. From afar, people would not have thought that that was a characteristic of French society, but there you have it among young, dispossessed people. Violence can break out, and so I think what we're looking at is, perhaps there's some cultural and social breakdown that can be attached to the media. But I think we're also looking at economic issues that are affecting huge numbers of people, and one of the ways that young people act out around their powerlessness is to try and take some power in the moment of violence, because that's a moment of control that they might have. So I think that those are a lot of the forces that are behind it. In terms of the question of gangs that are forming, I think you have to look even more deeply at some of the kinds of interchange between corrupt officials and gang life that go on in these countries if you're ever really going to tackle that.
Another big problem that's also taking place in Latin America is the issue of gangs, and that's kind of a reverse flow where they're being exported from the U.S. What are some of the steps that are being taken, Mr. Lewis, in order to try and help these countries with this problem? Because it also affects the U.S., because it's kind of a circular thing.
Yeah, I don't think there's any great clear answer to this issue as long as young people are being deported in the numbers that they are. Certainly, I think that there needs to be an emphasis on identifying some of the problems and working to rehabilitate people. The U.S. should be careful to inform the authorities when it's sending people who have a history of violence. I don't think there's any easy answer to this. When young people have gotten into a gang culture, been corrupted, and can go back to a country like El Salvador, where there's a history of extra-state violence, I think that this is a deadly formula, and I don't know what can be really done there to intervene other than to make attempts at enforcement, but not rely entirely upon that. There needs to be direct intervention and attempt to pull people out of those gangs, but this is tough.
Is it a combination of? Oh, sorry.
I was going to say I completely agree. I mean, this is a morass. This is a very difficult situation. The Maras in El Salvador have grown enormously in the past few years, and they're basically free to establish themselves as the primary criminal operations in that country. These are led by people who are deported from the U.S. So I do think that one step forward would be to sort of cast away this idea that you can deal with crime just by cracking down and throwing more people in jail or deporting them from your country. That clearly isn't going to work. You're going to get gangs in prisons. You're going to get interlinked networks of gangs between different countries and between and across prisons within one country. So it's a difficult process to rehabilitate criminals, but I think we have to go back to that notion that what the state's job is to take criminals and rehabilitate them, reintroduce them into society, and not just punish them by locking them away or deporting them.
But there's also a responsibility to the local government, especially the government of El Salvador, to do something about it, even though it is an export from the United States.
Well, I think the U.S. was, I think the government simply made a mistake, simply thought that they could just deport these people and just didn't think ahead and realize the dangerousness of doing so. I do think that I'm pretty sure that the State Department has kind of realized this error, and that they're trying to build a law enforcement center in El Salvador now, which, for better or for worse, might be able to build some capacity in this respect. I don't want to defend that effort, but I think the government's realized that this is a bigger problem than they initially understood it to be.
As the violence increases and continues in Latin America, what are some of the other consequences for the United States?
if indeed the violence grows, it's going to have an impact on economic development. Since we're now, especially in North America, an economically interdependent region, that's going to mean greater labor flow, greater migration flows, which are going to add to political confrontation in the United States over that issue. So it's, as part of a strategy of economic development, it's very important to deal with these questions of violence. And in the case of Mexico, for example, you really have to look at the institutions. Currently, President Calderón is engaged in what is, at least temporarily, a very popular campaign to crack down on narco-trafficking. Nevertheless, there's some real caveats around that. While it's building a lot of popularity for him at the moment, it's the kind of thing that could blow up, especially because the history of these kind of crackdowns in Mexico has been that when you push against one group, other groups form. If you use one part of the security apparatus, the army, for example, to push against the police forces that are linked to corruption, the army tends to become more corrupt. So whether there'll be long-term success there is questionable unless we get at the roots of why is there so much narco trade. And that brings the United States back into the question of, isn't the United States the one that is causing the demand, which is pulling all of this traffic through, which is enriching the criminal gangs throughout Latin America? And I think we really need to look at what are strategies in the United States for decriminalizing drugs, for finding other ways to handle this situation. There are some in Mexico who are saying, keep the money that you're planning to give us, spend it on rehabilitation in the United States. That will actually help us a great deal more than more handouts to do the kind of security that or the kind of crackdown that we're doing now.
I trust you enjoyed today's program. I'd like to thank our guests here in San Francisco, Ted Lewis, Director of the Human Rights Program at Global Exchange, and Benjamin Lessing from the University of California at Berkeley. I would also like to thank you at home or on the web for being with us today. We would also like to thank American University in Washington, D.C. and the students at the School of Communication for helping with the research for this program. Join us next time when we take a closer look at Latin America through the eyes of Latin American media. For more information about Pulso Latino and Latin America, log on to linktv.org. I'm Ana Cuevas. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time here on Latin Pulse.
Latin Pulse was made possible thanks to the generous contribution from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Pulso Latino ha sido posible gracias a la generosa contribución de la Fundación John D. y Catherine T. MacArthur.
This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs that connect you to the world.